You've seen the monuments, perhaps in photographs, perhaps in dreams, massive stones, hieroglyphs that seem to pulse with a forgotten life. And you've heard the quiet impulses, not with your ears, but with an older part of yourself, that these stones hold secrets, secrets about power, secrets that religious institutions, even the most ancient and revered, have fought tooth and nail to bury, not just from the world, but from you. The Vatican. It stands as a symbol of faith, of ancient tradition, of spiritual authority. Most people believe its greatest battles were waged against heresy, against the devil himself. But what if I told you the Church's deepest terror lay not in some horned demon, but in something far older, something inscribed on papyrus, something carved into stone, something that promised humanity a power that bypassed priests, bypassed rituals, bypassed even faith itself, a power that could reshape reality. This, then, is our first insight. The unseen architects of reality. Picture this: Paris, 1824. A forgotten wooden chest arrives at the Bibliothèque Nationale. It's mislabeled, marked simply as Roman fragments. Inside, though, is something far more ancient, a papyrus. It predates their oldest scrolls by centuries. When a curator finally deciphers the opening line, his world changes. This isn't about burial rites. It's not about the usual gods. The first phrase speaks of light. It mentions forces, forces that could reshape reality through sound alone. The text describes Egyptian priests. They commanded winds with quiet words. Temple chambers were designed for one purpose: to amplify human voices, to make them tangible power. Hieroglyphs were not just writing, they were vocal tools, tools for accessing unseen realms. Within days, Vatican representatives arrive. They offer astonishing sums for the scroll, astronomical money. The scholars return the next week. The papyrus has vanished. No explanation. What terrified the Church wasn't mythology. It wasn't the worship of animal-headed gods. It was instruction. This ancient text laid out techniques that bypassed faith entirely. It demanded only direct practice, only knowledge, only application. Even more disturbing, fragments of this Egyptian vocal power, they appear buried within early Christian prayers, cloaked in Latin, carefully altered. The Vatican then quietly adds a new entry to their forbidden text catalog. The reference number exists nowhere, not in public records. It simply doesn't exist for the outside world. Why? Because the possibility of direct access to divine power through your own voice, through your own understanding, threatens the very foundation of an institution that relies on you believing you need them. You have been taught to fear certain images, certain symbols. Anubis, for instance. You picture a snarling demon, a creature of darkness. Christian texts would later paint him that way. But Anubis, in truth, was a quiet guardian. He stood watch over the threshold. Between life and death, his jackal head wasn't meant to frighten. Jackals naturally gravitated to cemeteries. This made them perfect symbols for a god who guided souls through their final passage. He was protection, balance, sacred duty. He was the ultimate gatekeeper. Both stood in temple halls, his ibis head held high, scrolls of wisdom unfurling at his feet. He wasn't hoarding knowledge like some shadow figure. He was sharing it, teaching scribes the sacred art of hieroglyphs, showing priests how to calculate the Nile's flooding, revealing to anyone willing to learn the mathematical principles that built the pyramids. Even Sekhmet, fierce as she appeared, with her lioness head, she brought both destruction and healing. She could end plagues just as easily as she could start them. These were not monsters. They were not lurking in darkness. These were forces of nature, given form, teachers wearing animal masks, protectors. They understood true power required both creation and destruction. When Christianity began to expand through the Roman Empire, in those crucial early centuries, Egypt presented a unique problem. This wasn't some remote province with scattered local beliefs, easily absorbed or dismissed. Egyptian religion had been carved in stone for over 3,000 years. Before the first gospel was even written, their temples dominated city skylines. Their priests commanded respect across the Mediterranean, and their magic, their real, practical magic, it was integrated into every aspect of life. You couldn't simply tell an Egyptian farmer to stop invoking Isis for protection during childbirth. His grandmother had done it. His great-grandmother, countless generations, successfully. You couldn't walk into Alexandria, one of the ancient world's greatest centers of learning, and announce that all those mathematical, astronomical, and medical texts developed in temple schools were suddenly worthless. The Egyptian gods were not just believed in, they were lived with, worked alongside, consulted for everything, from healing broken bones to interpreting dreams. So the early church made a calculated decision, a strategic choice. Instead of trying to erase Egyptian religion entirely, which would have been impossible, they chose to twist it. This wasn't random persecution. It wasn't cultural misunderstanding. This was strategic warfare against ideas that threatened everything Christianity was trying to build. Watch how methodically it happened. Anubis, that patient guardian of the dead, he suddenly became associated with darkness, with evil. Christian writers began describing his jackal head as demonic, his role in judging the dead as sinister rather than protective. They took his image, the animal head, the dark coloring often used in Egyptian art. They recontextualized it entirely. Within a few generations, people who had once prayed to Anubis for safe passage into the afterlife were crossing themselves at the sight of his statues. Set faced even worse treatment as the Egyptian god of chaos, of storms, of necessary change. Set had always been complex, neither purely good nor evil. He represented the destructive forces that make new growth possible. Desert storms destroy, but they also bring rare life-giving rains. Chaos disrupts, but it also prevents stagnation. Christian writers stripped away all this nuance. They recast Set as pure evil, a prototype for Satan himself. His red hair, his unusual animal head, made the transformation easy. Suddenly he looked exactly like how medieval Christians would later imagine demons. Even Thoth, beloved god of wisdom and writing, he couldn't escape this systematic demonization. Christian texts began portraying him as a keeper of forbidden knowledge, his wisdom reframed as dangerous secrets that led people away from proper faith. The God who had taught humanity to write, to calculate, to understand the movements of stars, he became a shadow figure, associated with dark magic and heretical learning. But here's what made this transformation so effective. The church didn't just call these gods demons and leave it at that. They provided replacement narratives. Instead of praying to Isis for protection, people could pray to Mary. Instead of consulting Thoth for wisdom, they could trust in Christ. Instead of seeking Sekhmet's healing power, they could rely on Christian saints. The emotional and practical needs these gods had fulfilled for thousands of years, they were redirected toward Christian figures. The physical transformation was just as systematic. Egyptian temples were either destroyed or converted into churches, but often the original stones, they were reused. You can still walk into certain European cathedrals today and spot hieroglyphs carved into blocks shipped from dismantled Egyptian temples. Statues of gods were broken, but their pieces, they were sometimes incorporated into Christian buildings. as warnings. Anubis's head, it might appear in a carving about hell, or Set's image. It might be used to represent the demons Christ was trampling underfoot. If this examination of suppressed history ignites a desire within you to question more deeply, to seek what lies beneath, then consider this. Selecting the subscription option is how you ensure you don't miss our ongoing uncovering of truths. This then is the rebranding of divine power. What the Church couldn't completely erase, however, were the deeper ideas these gods represented. Walk through any old cathedral carefully, and you'll notice things that don't quite fit standard Christian iconography. Winged figures, they look more like Egyptian bybirds than biblical angels. Eyes that watch from unexpected corners, not the all-seeing eye of Christian tradition, but the eye of Horus, a symbol of protection and royal power. Animal-headed figures tucked into manuscript margins, their original meaning lost, but their forms somehow too important to abandon entirely. The real threat these Egyptian gods posed wasn't their animal heads or exotic rituals. It was the philosophy underlying Egyptian religion. Egyptian magic taught people they could access divine power directly. You didn't need a priest to intercede for you. With the right knowledge, the correct words, the proper rituals, you could speak to gods yourself. Death wasn't a terrifying unknown, requiring faith in salvation. It was a well-mapped process, with guidebooks, like the Book of the Dead, providing detailed instructions for making their way through the afterlife successfully. Most dangerously of all, Egyptian religion suggested that humans could become gods themselves. The pharaohs were not just divinely appointed rulers, they were living gods, and the magic that transformed them, it was theoretically available to anyone with sufficient knowledge and preparation. This wasn't heretical thinking, this was practical instruction. These ideas made people too free, too self-reliant, too willing to question authority. When you're building an empire of belief, an empire that depends on people accepting that salvation comes only through specific channels, only through proper authorities, only through unquestioning faith, you cannot allow competing systems that teach the opposite. Egyptian magic didn't just offer different answers, it taught people to ask different questions entirely. The gods were buried, but they were never completely forgotten. They live on in those hidden corners, in symbols whose meanings were lost, but whose power was too strong to abandon, in practices that survived by wearing Christian masks. The Church feared Egyptian magic more than the devil, because the devil, at least, kept people dependent on salvation. Egyptian magic suggested they might not need saving at all. Picture this: a medieval monk, hunched over candlelight, frantically copying manuscripts in a monastery scriptorium. But there's one type of text he's been explicitly forbidden to touch: Egyptian hieroglyphs. They weren't just considered foreign writing, they were branded as literal demonic script, a language that could cause scholars to lose their minds and open doorways to realms that should remain sealed. The Church's position was crystal clear. Anyone caught studying these symbols risked their soul. This wasn't mere superstition, it was calculated policy. Church authorities claimed that speaking hieroglyphic incantations aloud could summon entities, that the very act of deciphering these ancient marks invited spiritual corruption. Monasteries received explicit instructions to destroy any texts containing Egyptian symbols, and scholars who showed even academic curiosity found themselves facing excommunication, their research confiscated, their notes burned, their reputations destroyed through quiet accusations of sorcery. This then is the language of erased timelines. For over 1,000 years, this strategy worked perfectly. Hieroglyphs became a dead language from a lost world, their secrets buried. Under centuries of deliberate ignorance, the symbols remained visible on artifacts and monuments, but they might as well have been meaningless decorations. No one could read the stories, carved in stone, throughout Egypt's temples and tombs. Then Jean-François Champollion, he refused to listen to the warnings. Working in early 19th century France, Champollion possessed something medieval scholars lacked: the Rosetta Stone. This significant artifact, discovered during Napoleon's Egyptian campaign, contained the same text, written in 3 scripts: hieroglyphic, demotic, and ancient Greek. Since scholars could read Greek, they theoretically held the key to cracking the hieroglyphic code. But even with this advantage, the breakthrough took decades. Champollion's predecessors had assumed hieroglyphs were purely symbolic, each image representing a complete concept or idea. They approached the script like solving pictographic puzzles rather than reading actual language. Champollion's revolutionary insight came in 1822. He realized hieroglyphs weren't just symbols, they represented sounds, complete phonetic values. This was a full written language, as sophisticated as any modern script. The moment he could actually read hieroglyphs, the past began speaking. With startling clarity, Egyptian texts revealed astronomical knowledge that wouldn't be rediscovered in Europe until the Renaissance. Their medical papyri described surgical procedures and pharmaceutical preparations that demonstrated advanced understanding of human anatomy. Their mathematical texts showed geometric principles used in monument construction, principles that modern engineers still struggle to replicate. Most unsettling for religious authorities, the historical records painted a picture of continuous civilization stretching back to around 3100 BCE, and hints of organized society extending even further into prehistory. The Egyptian scribes had carefully documented king lists, building projects, trade relationships, astronomical observations across millennia of unbroken cultural development. But the really dangerous material, it lay in their spiritual texts: the pyramid, coffin, and Book of the Dead. These weren't primitive superstitions. They were sophisticated instruction manuals, detailed procedures for what Egyptians called traveling beyond the body, precise rituals for healing both physical and psychological ailments, and protective formulas that modern practitioners still study for their psychological insights. These weren't the writings of primitive people stumbling around in pre-scientific darkness. These were the records of scientists, astronomers, physicians, and mystics who had developed systematic approaches to understanding both material and non-material reality. They had mapped stellar cycles, calculated planetary movements, developed architectural techniques that modern builders can barely comprehend, and created a spiritual technology that challenged everything medieval Christianity taught about the nature of human consciousness. Suddenly, the Church's medieval terror, it made perfect sense. If people could read these walls, they might start asking uncomfortable questions. Why had this knowledge been suppressed? Who decided what history gets preserved and what gets erased? What other advanced civilizations might have existed before the official timeline begins? Picture this. You're standing in an ancient Egyptian temple at dawn. The high priest begins to speak, but he's not praying. He's commanding reality itself. Every syllable he utters carries the weight of creation. Each word a tool, more powerful than any sword or scepter. The Egyptians didn't see speech as mere communication. They understood something something that made the early Christian church deeply uncomfortable. Words were living entities, capable of reshaping the very structure of existence itself. When we looked at how Egyptian gods became Christian demons, we saw the church's fear of competing divine narratives. When we uncovered the secret language hidden in plain sight, we witnessed their terror of historical timelines that contradicted their authority. Now we're diving into perhaps their deepest fear, a magical system that gave ordinary people direct access to divine power through the simple act of speaking. The Egyptian concept of hika, sipper, often translated as magic, literally meant the power of words. But this wasn't stage magic or primitive superstition. This was a sophisticated understanding that consciousness and speech could influence physical reality. Egyptian priests didn't ask the gods for favors. They spoke divine names with such precision and authority that the universe had no choice but to respond. Imagine walking into a hospital today and watching a doctor heal someone, not with medicine, but by speaking their illness out of existence. That's the level of power the Egyptians attributed to properly spoken words. Here's where it gets truly unsettling. There was absolutely no distinction between prayer and spell. In ancient Egypt, when a priest chanted the secret name of Ra during the daily temple rituals, he wasn't hoping the sun would rise. He was ensuring it. The spoken word keeper 7, meaning to become, it was believed to literally bring things into existence. This wasn't metaphorical thinking. This was practical technology. The same word that described a beetle transforming was used for the fundamental creative force of the universe. Names held particular power because they contained the essence of what they described. Every Egyptian had multiple names: their common name, their true name, known only to family, and their secret name, a name that connected them directly to the divine. Carving someone's name in stone wasn't just memorial, it was a guarantee of continued existence. The hieroglyphs we discussed earlier, they weren't just writing, they were preservation spells, ensuring that speaking the deceased's name would literally call their spirit back into active existence. But here's what terrified the early church. If your name was completely erased from every surface, every record, every memory, your soul would cease to exist entirely. Conversely, as long as people spoke your name in ritual context, you remained alive in the most real sense possible. Death was simply a transition, and spoken memory was the bridge back to life. The Egyptians had essentially solved mortality through linguistic technology. Now imagine you're a Christian bishop in the 3rd century trying to establish a religion based on exclusive salvation through Christ, mediated by church authority. Suddenly you encounter a population that believes any properly trained person can speak directly to the divine and get immediate, measurable results. Worse, they believe that human speech itself contains creative power, that individuals can influence reality without any institutional oversight whatsoever. The clash was inevitable and brutal. Christianity required that salvation come through faith, obedience, and submission to church doctrine. The Egyptian magical tradition offered direct access to divine power through knowledge and technique. One system demanded believers remain spiritually dependent. The other promised spiritual autonomy. One required intermediaries. The other made every practitioner their own priest. The church's response was swift and systematic. They branded Egyptian magical speech as heresy, banned the ancient chants, and began censoring Coptic Christian prayers that blended traditional Egyptian invocations with Christian theology. Priests who continued using the old methods of speaking divine names were excommunicated, or worse, the idea that words themselves carried inherent energy, was reframed as witchcraft, blasphemy, and devil worship. But here's the twist that reveals the Church's true understanding of Egyptian magical principles. They didn't actually reject the power of spoken words. They monopolized it. While publicly condemning magical speech as satanic, the Vatican was secretly studying Egyptian texts, copying their techniques, and adapting their methods. Latin became the new sacred language, replacing the vernacular, just as Egyptian priests had used ancient formulaic speech. Catholic prayers required exact pronunciation and specific rhythmic patterns, remarkably similar to Egyptian magical chants. The practice of speaking in tongues, the power attributed to blessing and cursing, the belief that properly consecrated words could transform bread and wine into divine substance. All of this, it echoes Egyptian understanding of speech as creative force. Even today, Catholic ritual maintains the Egyptian insight that sacred speech requires precision. Priests must pronounce liturgical Latin correctly. For the sacraments to be valid, the words of consecration, they must be spoken exactly, in the proper sequence, with the right intention. Change a word, alter the rhythm, speak with doubt, instead of authority. In the miracle, it fails to occur. The Church kept extensive records of Egyptian magical practices in their restricted archives, studying exactly what they publicly condemned. Some historians argue that key elements of Christian mysticism, from contemplative prayer techniques to the power attributed to sacred names, were directly adapted from Egyptian magical traditions and simply rebranded as Orthodox Christian practice. What the Egyptians understood and what the Church feared people discovering is that consciousness and speech are intimately connected to the structure of reality itself. When you speak with genuine intention, when you align your words with deep conviction, something shifts in the world around you. This isn't superstition, it's something you've experienced firsthand. Think about the last time someone spoke your name with real love, or when harsh words left you feeling physically wounded. Consider how certain songs can transport you instantly to another time and place, or how a single phrase can change your entire emotional state. Notice how speaking your fears aloud often diminishes their power, while declaring your intentions can crystallize your resolve. The Egyptians believed that speaking with conscious purpose connects you to the same creative force that shapes reality. They understood that words aren't just symbols for things, they participate in the essence of what they describe. When you speak with genuine intention, aligned with deeper truth, you're not just communicating, you're collaborating with the fundamental creative principle of existence. The Church feared this knowledge, not because it was false, but because it was true. Once people understand that their own conscious speech carries real power, that they can connect directly with the divine through intention and knowledge, rather than institutional mediation, the entire structure of religious authority, it becomes questionable. The Egyptians were right. Words change things. Speaking with purpose, precision, and genuine intention, it does tap into something larger than individual consciousness. And once you truly understand this, once you recognize the creative power flowing through your own voice, you can never quite see the world the same way again. The question isn't whether this ancient knowledge was real. The question is, what happens when you start using it consciously? If these ideas, if this invitation to deeper inquiry resonates with your search for authentic knowledge, then I encourage you to look at our dedicated collections. We have a specific series on esoteric knowledge and another dedicated to demonology, where we examine these entities in their true unfiltered form, the kind of wisdom institutions try to keep hidden. You'll find the link to these playlists in the pinned comment below. This knowledge then is often found in the quiet moments of deep understanding. The spoken breath of creation. Picture this scene. You're standing in a tomb carved into limestone cliffs along the Nile. Your flashlight illuminates hieroglyphs. They cover every surface. As you read the translation, your skin starts to crawl, not because the words are foreign or frightening, but because they sound exactly like something you'd hear in church on Sunday morning. I am he who passes through the darkness and emerges into light. My flesh shall be made whole, my breath restored, my name called among the living. I have died and I have risen, and behold, I live forever in the fields of peace. Those words weren't carved yesterday. They weren't even carved when Jesus walked the earth. They're from spell 168 of the Egyptian Book of the Dead, inscribed on tomb walls over 1,500 years before the first gospel was written, and they describe in stunning detail a process of death, judgment, and bodily resurrection that should sound uncomfortably familiar to anyone raised in Christian tradition. The spell doesn't just mention resurrection in passing, it maps out the entire process. The soul travels through the underworld, faces divine judgment, where the heart is weighed against truth, and if found worthy, returns not just spiritually, but physically restored, complete with flesh, breath, and identity intact. The parallels aren't subtle suggestions, they're mirror images. When 19th century scholars first translated these passages in full, many experienced what they could only describe as intellectual déjà vu. Here was Osiris, the god who died and was resurrected, whose death brought salvation to others, whose followers could achieve eternal life through ritual identification with his process. Here were detailed descriptions of crossing waters to reach the afterlife, of being washed clean of sin, of standing before divine judgment, of light breaking through darkness as the soul emerges triumphant. The uncomfortable question hanging in the air was impossible to ignore. How could Egyptian priests describe Christian resurrection theology in such precise detail over a millennium before Christianity existed? The Church's response was swift and strategic. Rather than engage with these parallels directly, they chose a different path: controlled silence. When academic translations of the Book of the Dead were prepared for publication, certain pages mysteriously didn't make it into the final editions. Museum collections quietly moved their most explicit resurrection papyri into restricted access. Theological seminaries taught Egyptian religion as mythology, while presenting identical Christian concepts as historical fact. This wasn't accidental oversight. Church scholars understood exactly what they were looking at, and they recognized the implications. If these ideas had been fully developed and widely practiced in Egypt for over 1,000 years before Christ, he has suggested that Christianity might not have invented the resurrection story, but inherited it, refined it, and reframed it for new audiences. Spell 168 became something spoken about quietly in academic circles rather than openly discussed. Egyptologists would mention it in footnotes, always with careful qualifications about mythological thinking and symbolic, rather than literal meanings. The spell revealed that Egypt had its own judgment day, complete with divine scales, weighing souls against truth. It showed that the symbolism of crossing rivers, being washed clean, and stepping into eternal light had been carved into temple walls along the Nile for centuries before similar imagery appeared in Christian art. What made this particularly unsettling for church authorities wasn't that it disproved Christian doctrine. It was that it suggested Christianity might be part of a much older, deeper human story about death and rebirth, a story that transcended any single religion. The resurrection wasn't born in a Jerusalem tomb, but had been growing in human consciousness for millennia, with Egypt simply being the civilization that wrote it down most completely. The deeper you dig into spell 168, the more specific the parallels become. The Egyptian text describes the deceased declaring, "I have not sinned," being judged worthy, and receiving new life. It speaks of joining the divine family, of inheriting eternal kingdoms, of becoming one with the God through the resurrection process. These aren't vague spiritual metaphors. They're detailed theological frameworks that early Christians would later adopt almost wholesale. Modern Egyptologists, working with fresh translations and newly discovered papyri, find themselves in an awkward position. The evidence is overwhelming that Egyptian resurrection theology was sophisticated, widespread, and remarkably similar to later Christian doctrine. Yet discussing these parallels too explicitly can still be career-limiting in certain academic circles where religious sensitivities run deep. The Church couldn't ban the Book of the Dead outright. Too many copies existed. Too many scholars had access. Instead, they employed subtler strategies. They emphasized the primitive and superstitious nature of Egyptian beliefs, while presenting Christian resurrection as divinely revealed truth. They focused on differences rather than similarities, highlighting unique Christian elements while downplaying shared concepts. But here's what's fascinating about our current moment in history. With digital access to complete translations and comparative religious studies becoming mainstream, these parallels are impossible to ignore. Young scholars, approaching the texts without centuries of theological baggage, are seeing the connections clearly. They're asking the questions that make institutions uncomfortable. The resurrection spell doesn't clash with Christian belief. It mirrors it so closely that it forces us to ask bigger questions about human spiritual development. Maybe the story was never about one religion being right and others being wrong. Maybe it was about a fundamental human truth that different cultures expressed in their own languages and symbols. The most significant realization isn't that Christianity borrowed from Egypt. It's that both traditions might have been reaching towards something universal about human consciousness and our relationship with mortality. The idea of dying to an old self and being reborn into something eternal. It appears to be hardwired into our species, surfacing independently across cultures and centuries. Egypt just happened to write it down first, in exquisite detail, on stone walls that would survive long enough for us to read their ancient insights and recognize ourselves in their words. This then is resurrection's ancient mirror. Deep beneath the Vatican, past the tourist routes and public galleries, exists a museum that appears on no official map. There are no signs pointing toward it, no velvet ropes guiding visitors, no gift shop at the exit. This isn't a place designed to showcase treasures. It's a prison for ideas, where objects are contained rather than displayed. The entrance requires passing through layers of security that would make Fort Knox envious. Only the Pope himself and a select group of exorcists possess the authority to enter, past thick iron doors that haven't been opened for months at a time. Beyond guards who've signed vows of silence, more binding than any legal document, lie chambers filled with artifacts that have no business existing within the walls of any Christian institution. Walk through these forbidden halls, and you'll see amulets covered in hieroglyphs that seem to pulse with a faint light under candlelight, ancient scrolls wrapped in black cloth. They sit in climate-controlled cases, their contents so dangerous that even touching the fabric is said to invite catastrophe. Wooden statues of animal-headed gods. They line the walls. Anubis, Thoth, Sobek, their surfaces worn smooth from centuries of devoted worship by hands that understood their true power. But perhaps most unsettling is what some visitors have reported seeing in the deeper chambers, a mirror that reflects not your face, but visions. Visions written in languages that predate human speech. The few who've glimpsed it describe seeing symbols, symbols that burn themselves into memory, returning in dreams. For years afterward, why keep these artifacts at all? Why not simply destroy them and be done with the threat they represent? The answer reveals something significant about the Vatican's relationship with Egyptian magic. Even the Church's most powerful leaders, they fear what they don't fully understand. Some of these objects they've discovered are too powerful to burn. The flames simply won't take them. Others are too sacred or too dangerous to risk unleashing whatever energies might be released through their destruction. These artifacts represent evidence of a magical tradition that the Church spent centuries trying to erase from human memory. Yet here they are, locked away, but preserved, as if the Vatican recognizes that completely destroying this knowledge would be like trying to delete a fundamental chapter from the story of human consciousness. Among all the forbidden relics, one artifact generates more quiet conversations than any other. A black stone tablet, smooth as obsidian glass, covered in golden hieroglyphs, hieroglyphs that seem to pulse with their own internal rhythm, especially under moonlight. Vatican scholars who've studied it describe it as a kind of temporal map, a record of missing years in human history, documenting rulers who've been erased from official records and presenting alternative versions of events that would rewrite everything we think we know about ancient civilizations. The few priests granted access to study this tablet have followed a disturbing pattern. Some left the Church entirely, abandoning decades of service without explanation. Others went mad, speaking in languages linguists couldn't identify. A handful became exorcists, as if exposure to the tablet awakened them to spiritual realities the Church barely acknowledges, and some simply vanished completely. Their disappearances explained away as reassignments to distant missions. Then there's the ring, locked inside a lead-lined box that requires 3 separate keys to open. This simple band of gold bears an engraving of a serpent devouring the sun. Church records trace its ownership to a high priest of Thoth, acquired during the Crusades, through means the Vatican prefers not to document. Legend surrounding this ring claims that if it were ever returned to its original temple in Egypt, it would trigger a new era of magical awakening, a renaissance of the very powers Christianity worked so hard to suppress. The ring stays hidden for precisely this reason. Its very existence represents a kind of magical time bomb, a key that could open doors the Church insists must remain sealed forever. But maintaining a collection of such powerful artifacts comes with costs that extend beyond mere security concerns. Father Luca Verno, he learned this the hard way. Appointed as the vault's keeper in 2003, he initially took his responsibilities seriously, following every protocol, maintaining meticulous records, treating his role as a sacred duty to protect the Church from dangerous influences. The problems began subtly. Something that felt like communication seemed to come from behind the vault doors during his night shifts. Not voices exactly, his dreams filled with symbols he'd never seen before, hieroglyphs that felt familiar. Despite his lack of training in ancient languages, most disturbing, he began to sense a presence growing stronger each time he opened the chambers, as if something inside was feeding from the exposure to human consciousness. Verno's private journal, discovered after his death, reveals a man grappling with questions that cut to the heart of the Vatican's relationship with these artifacts. Why preserve objects that are supposedly evil? Why do some of them appear to have moved when no one was watching? Why did he feel increasingly certain that whatever intelligence resided within these relics wasn't sleeping, but waiting? His final journal entry, dated just 3 days before his death, contained only 4 words: "It followed me home." Father Verno was found dead in his apartment, his body arranged in a position that suggested peaceful sleep, except for one detail that made investigators deeply uncomfortable: drawn on the floor around his bed, in what appeared to be fine ash, was a symbol that no expert in ancient languages, occult studies, or religious iconography could identify. The symbol seemed to shift when photographed, appearing different in each image, despite being captured within minutes of each other. The Vatican's response was swift and decisive. Verno's body was buried in a private ceremony with no public record. The room where he died was sealed and later demolished. During routine renovations, the vault was reassigned, but not to a single keeper. Now it requires 2 exorcists, and they're never allowed to enter alone. Perhaps most telling, several items from the collection disappeared during the transition period. After Verno's death, the Vatican has never acknowledged what went missing, but security protocols were immediately upgraded to levels typically reserved for nuclear facilities. The new rules reflect a hard-learned lesson. The vault keeper had become the warning. Father Verno's fate demonstrated that proximity to these artifacts changes people in ways the Church doesn't fully understand and can't effectively control. This, then, is the vaults of forbidden memory. Today, the vault remains what it has always been: a wound in the heart of Christianity, sealed with silence and maintained through fear. It houses not just objects, but memories of a time when magic was as real as mathematics, when words could reshape reality, and when the line between human and divine was far more permeable than modern religion allows us to believe. The forgotten gods of Egypt, they may be locked away, but their presence continues to challenge everything. The Church claims to know about the nature of spiritual power, and somewhere in those darkened chambers, ancient wisdom waits patiently for its moment to return to the world. The men who burned Giordano Bruno at the stake in 1600, they never really went away. They just changed their clothes. While we imagine the Inquisition died with the last autopsy, something far more sophisticated took its place. The Vatican learned that robes and public trials drew too much attention. Better to work in shadows, targeting not the heretics who scream blasphemy in town squares, but the quiet impulses that slip through cracks in our rational world. Ancient forces that shouldn't exist in an age of satellites and smartphones, yet keep surfacing anyway. They call themselves the Thesta Custodes Umbrae Stet, the keepers of the shadow. Officially, they don't exist. No office in Vatican City, no budget line in the Holy See's finances, no public records. But when a sealed Egyptian charm box washes up on a Sicilian beach, and the local fisherman who opens it starts speaking fluent Middle Egyptian, a language dead for 15 centuries, these are the men who arrive on the next flight from Rome. Unlike the parish priests, these operatives are polyglots who've memorized thousand-year-old prayers in languages that predate Latin. They train not in seminaries, but in unmappable monasteries, tucked into alpine valleys or under desert mystics and Coptic elders, whose lineages trace back to the temples of Thoth. Many speak a dozen tongues fluently, including hieroglyphic variants that most Egyptologists have never encountered. Their work operates several levels deeper than the Congregation for the Doctrine of Faith, the modern successor to the Old Inquisition. While that office deals with theological disputes and wayward bishops, the Hopticustodes Sepen handle what their files euphemistically call anomalous manifestations of pre-Christian spiritual technology. They travel in plain clothes, often posing as art historians or archaeological consultants, but they always carry certain items, small reliquaries containing bone fragments of early Christian martyrs, protective amulets, blessed by popes whose names never appear in official records, and sigils inscribed with binding formulas that blend Latin prayers with much older, protective symbols. They need these protections because their investigations aren't academic exercises. Consider the Daronia incident from 2019. A rural landowner renovating a 12th century farmhouse discovered a leather-bound manuscript sealed inside a wall cavity. The book was written in what appeared to be medieval Latin, but when read aloud, the words seemed to speak back. Within days, the farmer was reporting vivid dreams of Egyptian temples and finding his property covered each morning with symbols carved into the earth, symbols that matched those we saw earlier in the Vatican's hidden collection. A 3-man Tectostode team arrived within 48 hours, identifying themselves as researchers from the Vatican Library. They retrieved the manuscript, but only 2 of them returned to Rome. The third, Father Alessandro Toretti, simply vanished. The remaining agents filed their report under the highest classification level, then disappeared back into their shadow network. The official story listed Toretti as taking a leave of absence for health reasons. He was never seen again. The uncomfortable truth is, we can't be certain whether these modern inquisitors are protectors, keeping dangerous knowledge from falling into the wrong hands, or silencers, preventing the right questions from being asked. Some rogue Jesuits claim the Custodes don't just seal away magical texts, they burn them, systematically erasing rituals and formulas that come too close to revealing truths. The Church has spent centuries suppressing the strangest rumors concern what happens to agents who work too long with these anomalies. Father Marcus Bellicourt, a custodian's operative for over 2 decades, reportedly stopped aging sometime in his 40s. Colleagues noticed he looked identical in photographs spanning 15 years. Another agent, Sister Catherine Mario, went completely blind during a mission in Cairo, but could somehow describe events occurring miles away with perfect accuracy. Their classified files, glimpsed by whistleblowers, contain pages of redacted names, blacked out mission dates, and quiet warnings about prolonged exposure protocols. Some agents are rotated out after just 3 years. Others seem to work indefinitely, but their personnel records show gaps, months or years, where their whereabouts are completely unaccounted for. You might think that in our age of digital archives and satellite surveillance, magic would be dead, crushed under the weight of scientific rationalism, but it hasn't disappeared. It's learned to hide, slipping through the cracks of our hyper-connected world. The Vatican knows this, which is why they upgraded their old systems rather than shutting them down. The medieval Inquisition burned books in public squares. The modern version operates server farms that scrub certain texts from digital archives before they can spread, where their predecessors tortured confessions from accused witches Today's agents trace IP addresses and monitor online forums where people discuss unusual experiences with ancient artifacts. This isn't really about belief anymore. It's about control, because regardless of what you accept as possible, some of these spells, regardless of their age, still work. The hieroglyphic resurrection formulas we examined earlier don't just sit inert on papyrus. When properly activated, they produce effects that challenge everything we think we know about reality. The modern Inquisition exists to maintain the comfortable illusion that such forces don't exist, that the ancient Egyptian knowledge the Vatican feared enough to suppress for 2 millennia is safely buried in the past. But every time a construction crew uncovers a sealed canopic jar, every time someone translates the wrong passage from the Book of the Dead, every time the old magic surfaces in our rational world, the feared custodes sipped are there to contain it. They are the inheritors of a war that began when the first Christian missionaries encountered the priest-magicians of Alexandria, and like that ancient conflict, this modern Inquisition has no intention of ending, because the alternative, a world where people rediscover what the pharaohs really knew about life, death, and the forces that govern both, remains too dangerous for the church to permit. It started with something so simple, you probably dismissed it completely. A few years ago, unconventional posts began appearing across social media platforms. Glowing inks overlaid on nighttime cityscapes, ancient Egyptian chants mixed over lo-fi hip-hop beats, teenagers discussing Thoth like he was the latest trend. The imagery was striking. Young people in bedrooms lined with papyrus prints, drawing hieroglyphs in notebooks, talking about dream visits from falcon-headed gods. With the same casual intensity, they discuss a Netflix series most adults wrote it off as another internet phase. Kids cycle through obsessions constantly: crystal healing, astrological charts. This Egyptian thing, it would fade like all the rest, except it didn't fade. It grew quietly, organically, spreading through Discord servers and private Instagram accounts, until an entire generation that was supposed to forget history started actively reviving something far older than the church ever wanted remembered. This then is the return of the forgotten. They call it Kemetism, a return to Hiti Kemet, Seta, which was ancient Egypt's true name before Greek colonizers renamed it. But this isn't the Egypt of high school textbooks with their sanitized pyramid tours and mummy exhibits. This is the Egypt the Vatican worked for centuries to bury, the land of living gods, sacred symbols that carried actual power, and spells carefully preserved in tombs and museum basements that most people never get to see. What's remarkable is how serious this revival has become. These aren't kids playing dress-up or collecting themed jewelry. They're reading actual pyramid text translations, studying lunar cycles, the way their ancestors tracked planting seasons, decoding star maps that align with monuments built thousands of years ago. Some report dreams where Egyptian deities speak to them in voices that feel older than language itself, not in words, but in concepts that download directly into understanding. Running parallel to this Kemetist revival, something even more threatening to established religious authority: the return of Hermeticism. Remember those teachings I mentioned earlier that were spoken of in secret chambers by initiates who risked their lives to preserve them? Now they're being shared in Discord threads and annotated on Instagram stories. The Emerald Tablet, the Kabbalion, concepts about universal connection and consciousness that the church spent centuries trying to eradicate. They're all back, accessible to anyone with an internet connection. I've seen teenagers quote Hermes Trismegistus Instead of social media influencers, they discuss ascension and inner alchemy with the same depth that previous generations debated politics or pop culture. They talk about memory recovery, not just personal memories, but ancestral ones, genetic impulses of knowledge that was systematically suppressed. And here's what makes the Vatican nervous. These young people aren't approaching this as rebellion against Christianity. They're approaching it as an archaeology of truth. The Church noticed, because it always does, when the past refuses to stay buried, especially when that past threatens their singular narrative. If Egyptian spiritual systems start making sense to modern minds again, if young people begin seeing Christianity not as the divine end point of human spiritual evolution, but as a reinterpretation of something much older than foundational assumptions start cracking. A document from the Vatican's Cultural Observatory. Yes, they have people whose job is monitoring cultural trends that might threaten church authority. It flagged this revival as theological destabilization. The concern isn't about actual magic or supernatural threats. The fear is about questions. Questions like, why do biblical stories recount Egyptian myths so precisely? Why are Christian saints described using the same attributes as Egyptian gods? Why do early Christian texts contain barely hidden traces of the very practices the Church later condemned as heretical? But there's something deeper happening here, something that goes beyond intellectual curiosity or historical research. People involved in this revival describe experiences that suggest something is genuinely awakening, not just individually, but collectively. They talk about genetic memory, ancestral impulses, a pull toward temples that no longer exist, and languages we were taught not to hear. Some describe it as recognition, rather than learning, as if they're remembering, rather than discovering. In certain circles, this revival has moved beyond academic study into actual practice. Candle ceremonies, conducted in apartments and basements, spoken invocations, in reconstructed ancient Egyptian, meditations guided by symbols, carved in stone. Before Christ was born, practitioners describe experiences that transcend normal consciousness, moments when the air itself seems to change, when they feel witnessed not by other people, but by intelligences that are genuinely ancient. This isn't teenage rebellion or even religious belief in the conventional sense. It's recognition, a growing awareness that the official story of human spiritual development isn't complete, that something crucial was left buried in the sands, taken from us systematically, and that calling it back might change everything about how we understand ourselves and our relationship to the divine. The Church has always feared Egypt's return, not the modern country, but the idea, the knowledge, the magic, because once Egyptian wisdom rises again, it doesn't just challenge specific doctrines or compete with Christian theology. It burns away the illusion that history moves in a straight line, that truth belongs to the present, that newer automatically means better or more evolved. Maybe this new Egypt isn't a place at all. Maybe it's a memory that was never fully erased, a frequency that's been broadcasting across thousands of years, waiting for the right conditions to be received clearly again. And maybe, just maybe, those conditions are finally here. You've listened to this. You've felt the connections. You've weighed the evidence. What part of this truth resonated with you most strongly? Share your thoughts below. I'm keen to read what personal revelations this ancient knowledge sparked within you.